is a production function. It takes labor and capital and converts it into output. The conception of a firm is as a optimizing vehicle with full information. The firm knows pretty much everything out there. The firm is a production function, optimizes the output at every moment in time and maximizes profit. But as we were studying firms and trying to understand competitive advantage, we came to understand that firms are anything but simple. Firms are incredibly complex, and this concept of the value chain was one of the core frameworks that I introduced in the strategy work that I've been doing in the 80s largely. And the value chain just is a representation that the firm is a complex set of activities. That firms are involved in doing business in hundreds of different activities and processes. Procurement, operations, marketing, customer service, IT, technology development, procurement, hundreds and hundreds of activities. And these activities and the choices that the company makes ultimately result in the competitive advantage of the firm. All competitive advantage in a firm grows out of the ability to perform some of these activities in a unique and distinctive way. And all of a sudden, the idea that every firm would know everything about all the choices that it could possibly make in that value chain, and thought of all the opportunities to improve environmental performance simply became unrealistic. Every firm makes mistakes every day. Economists have a hard time dealing with this. They think of the firm as optimizing, and maybe it does in some sense of optimizing within limited information, but firms have too many things to do. There are too many issues to worry about. There's many complex choices to be made. There are hundreds of investment projects, hundreds of different things where you can put capital. Very hard to measure the return on many of those things. And in a world like this, where firms are like this, it became very plausible that regulation, by kind of riveting the attention of the firm on important issues like energy use and like emissions, would potentially have a profound impact on where the firm put its energy in terms of innovation and where it put its capital in terms of investment. And so I think part of the story here in the Porter hypothesis is a much more complex view of what firms are really like. And I think if we want to be successful in regulation, we have to embody and embrace this view of what firms are actually like, and the complexity and the multitude of choices and the lack of information and the limited bandwidth that firms have. And I think that has profound effects on how regulators need to do their job. And we'll talk about some of those things later. Now, in addition to kind of a conception of the firm that was quite different than the kind of traditional neoclassical view of the firm in economics, we also were in a period where we were starting to develop a very different conception of what was competitiveness. The traditional conception of competitiveness that I encountered when I came into the field was that competitiveness is about cost minimization. So people would say you're competitive if you have low wages. You're competitive if your currency is low. You're competitive if your costs are low. And what became clear is that actually that's not necessarily true. But moreover, it's a very bad way of thinking about competitiveness from the point of view of social progress. We don't want low wages. We want to create an environment where we can support high wages. And therefore, as we came to understand, the countries that are prosperous, the countries that are competitive, are the countries that are productive. The countries that can utilize resources productively and that can drive productivity growth over time. And this conception of competitiveness put a very different light on the question of environmental regulation. Because if you have a very short-term, narrow cost perspective about competitiveness, then you're much more likely to think that environmental regulation is sort of an unambiguous negative. But if you have a productivity perspective and productivity growth perspective on competitiveness, and you realize that the environment involves the use of many resources, then all of a sudden the idea that if you could somehow, if regulation somehow stimulated innovation, that could improve competitiveness, all of a sudden that is what's so crazy. And again, this was the sensibility with which I was thinking during this period, and I continue to work in this area since. And then really the third piece here was, okay, so what's the role of location in competitiveness and in productivity growth? And what we came to understand is that location matters a lot, that where the company is based and kind of the environment surrounding the company can have a profound effect on how competitive it can be and how productive it can be. And in particular, as I've highlighted here, the work we did on competitiveness was really suggesting the profound impact of what we call demand conditions. The signals that the company is getting from the customer, from the marketplace, about the standards or the quality or the features that the company needs to meet. So let me tell you one funny story, which is, you all probably know this, but the Japanese actually are the world's leader in GPS. I don't know if you know that, but all the leading innovators and the dominant players in that area are Japanese. Now you might say, why aren't the Americans the innovators in GPS? Because of course we were the ones that put up these satellites and have all the IT and all that stuff that would seem to make us the natural player. Well, the answer is demand conditions. In Japan, addresses are not consecutive. So if you go on a street, it's not house number 1, house number 3, house number 4. Addresses are kind of random. So if you don't know where you're going, I mean, if you don't know exactly where the house is, you can't find it in any simple process. So the Japanese have this incredible need for GPS. Just like they had an incredible need for fax machines, because the typewriters and telexes of the day didn't work with Japanese characters. And so they had to have a way of transmitting handwritten documents, because most documents in Japan were handwritten. Those are cases where the demand conditions, the nature of the local needs, have a profound effect on innovation. In America, we thought of the fax machine and the GPS as kind of a curiosity, nice to have, kind of a toy for people who had everything. In Japan, the fax machine was a business necessity. In Japan, the GPS was critical, and that was even before you added the legendary traffic jams in Tokyo. In Japan, when you tune onto your GPS, it will tell you exactly where the traffic jams are. They're way ahead of us. They've already embodied that technology into the GPS system. Why? Because there was an incredible demand. There was an incredible need. And what we came to understand is that environmental regulation is one of those demand conditions. By setting environmental standards, if you set them in the right way, by setting them relatively high, you really stimulate innovation, or can stimulate innovation. And we see that over and over and over again in industry and after industry. So again, if one has this narrow kind of view of the firm as maximizing profits at every moment in time, and if you have this narrow view that competitiveness is about lowering short-term costs, then of course you would think the Porter hypothesis was complete lunacy. But if you have this perspective on the firm and on competition and on competitiveness, all of a sudden one's mind is open to a broader approach. One corollary of the whole concept of competitiveness and the role of location is the notion of clusters. That competitiveness doesn't arise in isolated firms. Competitiveness arises in critical masses of firms in a particular location that feed off each other. And this is sort of a pictorial of the life sciences cluster in Massachusetts, probably the strongest life sciences concentration of firms and institutions in the world. And there's a lot of synergies where you've got all these companies in the same location. You get a lot of efficiencies and a lot of opportunities for dynamism and innovation and new business formation. And we have increasing data on that. We see clusters in every industry all over the world. Here's a representation of the wind power cluster in Spain. Spain is doing really, really well in international competition in the area of wind power. And of course, part of that, for those of you that know the story, has to do with some demand conditions.